Hello, friends. Today, we'll be talking about Seraphina's Lament by Sarah Chorn. Before we get into the review, I always like to mention that I'm weird about spoilers. So during these videos, I will not spoil anything for you. I like to go into books blind, not knowing anything or as little as possible. So I won't be spoiling any major plot points, any character development, anything like that. I'll just give you my thoughts on the book, and you can decide whether it's for you or not for you. And if you're like me and like to go into books blind and you're curious about the synopsis, I would say the synopsis is probably safe to read. It doesn't spoil much for you at all. It kind of gives you again, like an overview of kind of the world that you're stepping into, but it doesn't give anything away. So if you're concerned about that, if you're like me and you avoid the synopsis a lot of the time, this one is safe to read. If you like to go into books blind, it won't spoil anything for you. So I wasn't quite sure what to expect with this one. I knew it was Grimdark, and just by talking to Sarah a little bit, I kind of had an idea for the approach she takes. She had mentioned something like she doesn't pay attention until someone's in pain. So I kind of knew what I was in for. I had no clue. I just kind of knew the type of story. I knew that there would be pain and suffering, and there's plenty of that. But Sarah has a very unique writing style, and on the blurb on the cover, it says that it's a lyrical style, and I think that's a perfect way of saying it. It's a very lyrical, almost poetic kind of prose that she writes in, and it took me a minute to adjust to it because it was like a different rhythm to it. But after a few pages, I got into it, and it was consistent throughout the book. It didn't switch back and forth, so that helped too because it was all the way through, and it fit the lyrical style, that poetic, that use of metaphors and things like that. All that fit into the story very well. It fit the type of story it was. The writing style fit, so it didn't feel like a modge podge of kind of just like showing off just to show off. It fit the story. It fit the tale that was being told. I would say Seraphina's Lament is a mix of dark fantasy / grimdark, if you believe it exists, and just a pinch of horror. I think there's just a little bit of horror, just enough. I think grimdark is that bridge between those two genres, horror and fantasy. I think, in my mind at least, that's kind of the bridge that you can travel back and forth on between the two genres. So it wasn't surprising to see that. I see that a lot in a lot of grimdark, the magic systems and what happens. There is a little bit of horror mixed in there, and it's not very rare that I get so invested in characters that I really start to care about them. And in this world, it's the government that runs this area that we're living in. It's very oppressive. It rules everything in the characters' lives. Their livelihoods, their survival. It's a struggle just to survive, not even just make a living, but it controls so much of the everyday life in this part of the world. And so you can, from the very beginning, you feel that weight of you have very little control. And when I was about halfway through, I was talking with P.L. Stewart, my friend and author P.L. Stewart, about this book, and he had mentioned, because he had already read it, and he said, that book I think is as dark as Beyond Redemption. And for those of you who haven't read Beyond Redemption, I'm going to make a comparison here. Hopefully you're at least familiar with Beyond Redemption, but it's regarded as one of the darkest grimdark books, one of the most like bleakest grimdark books, and I would agree with that. And I was about halfway through at the time, and I said, well, it's dark, but I don't know if it's that dark. By the time I was finished, I think it's on par with Beyond Redemption, with just that feeling of hopelessness, and just you can't, it's like you have very little control. It's like you're running into a brick wall over and over again. These characters just cannot, just have very little control. It just feels like there's nothing that they can do. Like it feels very, the weight is on them all the time, and you really feel that, and you really get invested in the characters. There are some, unlike Beyond Redemption, and I'll try not to compare this to Beyond Redemption too much, but in Beyond Redemption, all the characters are unlikable. But in Seraphina's Lament, there are some characters that are likable, that you root for, you can latch onto. So if that's a concern for you in these type of books, I think you could say that there are characters you can latch onto and care about, that you root for. Not all of them are terrible people. They're placed in a very terrible situation, but you see humanity and you see this different side of people when they're faced with this type of oppression, this type of they're this people want to, governments and this type of control on people. You see the good in people come out, and you see that resilience, and that, no, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to help people. I'm going to stay here, even if it means that I'll lose everything, or I'll be killed or tortured. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to help people. And that you see that those bright sides of humanity come out in these types of situations. And that's true in this book as well. You see the goodness in people come out, and that resiliency and that caring for other people, even to the last minute, you see that side of humanity come out. And even faced with, this type of, resistance, you see that come out, even though they know it's futile and it's only for a few minutes, you see that come out in people. And I think that really, really got to me. There's one character, and I won't spoil anything, but there's a character death that you kind of see coming. And I think we're so used to, in these types of tales, that once we get attached to a character, once time is spent on a character, you start to assume that they're going to make it. And I should know better by now. But that's why I love these types of books. That's why I love Grimdark, if you believe in that and it exists, or dark fantasy, these types of stories that they don't pull punches. And you get attached to these characters, you really care about them, and you see something coming. You see something really terrible is about to happen, and you think something's going to save them. Somebody's going to come in, something's going to happen, something miraculous at the last minute is going to prevent this terrible thing from happening. And it's not that kind of book. It's not that kind of story. And there was one character death who you kind of see things building. And like I said, I won't spoil it, but you see things building and building, and you think, I don't know. Maybe it's just me hoping it wasn't going to happen. But I kept thinking, something's got to happen. Something's got to happen to save this person. So there's some event at the last minute is going to save them, and it's not that kind of story. And I was reading like this with a hand, just reading like this, like I didn't want to read it, but I wanted to read it. But once that whole once those scenes concluded and the end was there, I had to put the book down and walk around for a few minutes. I've never had to do that before. I've never had to set a book down, like put the bookmark in, set it down, stand up and walk around. And, because I got all teary-eyed over it, and that doesn't happen too often either. Not that like I'm a big tough guy. It's like, it doesn't happen that often. So there's been 2 books in the last few months that have got me teary-eyed. This is one of them. And, but the way that it was done, it was just so beautiful and so touching and brutal, and it really got to me. It really got to still think about it. So we also have different points of view, and I'm weird about points of view as well. When we switch too often with points of view, especially in fantasy, I get confused, or I just don't feel like I can latch on to a character. In this book, we spend enough time with each character that there aren't too many of them. There's enough that you can keep track of who's who, and they all feel very defined. They feel like real people, and it made it easier for me to follow along. And all of their different journeys, you don't really see where it's going until their arcs start to converge and start to intersect. And I won't say when that happens or what happens, of course, but when that does happen, it's kind of like, oh, okay. So it was a great conclusion when all the characters, all their arcs start to overlap, and you start to see what's really happening and why things happen. There's some things that happen, it's not really explaining, and you're kind of wondering, well, what is going on? Like, why did that happen? But at the end, when everything comes together, when all these character arcs overlap, it's like, oh, that's what that was, kind of thing, where it's like the light goes off, and it's like, oh wow. And I loved the conclusion. It kept me thinking. Like, it's another book that just keeps me thinking. That's the kind of book, those kind of stories that I really love, the ones that keep you thinking. And I kept me thinking about things that I didn't, you don't expect a fantasy book usually to keep you thinking, to keep you in thought. So when I did finish and when I turned the last page, I felt like I read a story bigger than what I realized it was at the time, if that makes sense. Because at the time I thought I was thoroughly enjoying it. But when I was finished and I had time to reflect and I had time to kind of just absorb it, I thought that story is bigger than what it seems. There's more to it than just what I just read. Even though I thoroughly enjoyed it, I loved it, it just felt like it was bigger than what I realized it was at the time. If you're a fan of Grimdark or dark fantasy or what I just described, give it a try. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. It's relatively short for a fantasy book. I think it's 344 pages, so it's not huge. It's not a huge time investment if that's a concern for you. I know some people avoid fantasy because it's like, I don't have time to read a 700 or 800 page book, which I totally understand. There are some books like this that are smaller, that are more accessible for people who don't want to invest that much time into a fantasy book. So if you're into horror, into grimdark, dark fantasy, or just good stories, this, like I said, the writing style is great. There's a few times when, even if there's something terrible going on in the story, and I read just like a word choice or a sentence or just this clever use of just like this cleverness in the prose, I would stop and smile and just like enjoy the writing. Even though something really terrible was in the middle of happening, I would still just sit there and smile because it's just so cool. It's like neat. It's neat when that kind of thing happens. So if you can't tell, I really, really enjoyed it. This book will be on my top 10, maybe top 5 of the year. Like I said, it's kept me thinking. I had a little bit of a hangover after. Like when you read a really great book and you have a hangover after, you just can't feel like you can move on. You just have to feel like you have to like sleep it off, kind of thing. That's the way I felt, but in a good way. So like I said, if you're a hardcore grimdark reader, this is a must read for you. Or if you're into the other things I described, go check it out. Like I said, it is on Kindle Unlimited, so you can read it there, or you can order a copy via Amazon. So have you read Seraphina's Lament? If you have, let me know down below what you would rate it. As always, I hope this review is helpful. Until next time, I will talk to you soon.